Thanks. Let me reshare. All right. Just feel the energy in the room. Okay, so I'm going to talk about fast rate loops, or perhaps more precisely, fast rate loops, but that's a little bit of a mouthful. Oh. Aha. Okay, quick overview of the agenda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about control principles. I defer to the experts in the room. So I'm sort of, if they say something that contradicts me, believe them, not me. But I'll give you my sort of simple view of the world, which has stood me in good stead for the way I've sort of run and flown copters in particular. And then talk about rate control in particular and how you can get good rate control in copters. A little bit about requests versus outputs, and then a digression into what makes Betaflight so good for acro effectively, and how we're sort of starting to compare with them, or even do compare with them. A little bit on the limits of rate control, like what stops us being perfect, and then the implementation that I've done. So there's a PR for this that I was flying yesterday. So the demo you saw was flying this code, which was a little bit scary, but it all worked out well. And some of the challenges I ran into producing that, and then some results, some sort of numbers-based results, and then what I might do in the future. All right, moving swiftly on. A little bit about me. So I work for FOSS UAV, but really that's just me. That's my side hustle company. My day job is that I run the engineering department for an AI startup based in Oxford. And that consumes a bunch of my time, and then this consumes the rest of my time, and I sort of have no time for anything else. But this is my passion, is drones and flying and coding to some degree. My background is actually in sort of big systems, big enterprise systems, distributed systems, primarily in Java. But early on in my career, I did C++, which is why I'm sort of now hacking once again on RGPilot. All right, so control principles. There's not really to sort of give you a 101 on control principles, but just to emphasize that the controllers that we use, that are PID controllers, proportional, integral, derivative, are based on, I don't know whether, my cursor doesn't work, are based on the error. Okay, so it's just really important to remember that these controllers are based on reacting to error. And so you sort of want you to hold that in your mind as we sort of go through this. So we detect an error, we apply some sort of proportional input based on the error, integral based on the error, derivative based on the error, create new outputs, and then go around that loop again. So it's a feedback process. So just talking about error a little bit more. So where does the error come from? And there's essentially two places. So one is reacting to your stick inputs, essentially, or the ETF controlling the vehicle or whatever. So this is control input. And the interesting thing about this is it's slower. So on Copter, radio maybe hits 200 hertz tops. And I think on plane often it's 50 hertz. So just sort of relatively low update rate. And you put in a control input that makes a rate request. Then you have an error between what you requested and what's actually going on. And so the Copter adjusts. And we do that pretty well. But then you've got to think about disturbance error. So I've got a little Copter here. So it's not the one that was flying yesterday, but it's almost identical. So disturbance error is where something hits it externally, usually prop wash or noise or whatever. And what you got to remember with this is that can happen at a very, very fast rate. So if you sort of fly through prop wash, you got to, just very, very, very fast rate of error being created. And we adjust for that quickly at the moment. We adjust for that in the main loop at 400 hertz. Okay. So diving in a little bit more, so typical sort of PID response type graphs might look something like this. So you can see in the blue, we've got a step input here, and we've got different responses to this based on the different parameters that would be set for P, I, and D. So you can see on the red, we've got a very damped response here, sort of it gets slowly to the target. You can see the purple overshoots by a massive amount and oscillates, gradually damping down. The one I haven't shown here is where the copter flies away, and that's where the oscillation keeps building up and to infinity. And then the green one is sort of roughly what we want, which is a sharp response followed by meeting the required target. And I've shown this graph before, but there's a little bit of an error in this graph that is relevant to this talk. And you see what I did there. So the error is that there's a little bit of latency between the step response and actually creating the output. So it would be more it would be more correct to show the step response occurring earlier, and then the step input occurring earlier, and then the rate response occurring a little bit later with a little bit of latency. And it turns out this latency is actually very, very important to good control, at least for my copters. So if latency is important, how do we manage latency in control? And the thing we've just looked at is sort of feedback latency. So something happens, you react to it, you produce an output, and that minimizes the error buildup. So what you got to think about is you got a copter like this, and a disturbance comes in, and you've measured where the copter is, and what the error is between what you want and what you need. What you got to remember is the copter keeps moving after that measurement has happened until you apply the output, and so you get this error buildup that is very much dependent on the latency between reading and reacting. And so this is latency that you want to minimize to get more accurate control. There are other things you can do. So you can actually do feed forward input. And so this copter does feed forward and derivative feed forward. And this is where you sort of got a model where you can predict what the output will be based on an input. And therefore you don't have to wait for the error to build up. You apply the output directly. And that works for some situations, but you can't sort of know exactly what's going to happen, you can't control a copter that way. Although planes are obviously controlled much more based on feed forward, but it is important. And so, in particular for these sort of copters, derivative feed forward as well allows you to sort of snap into and out of rolls, for instance, where you're moving your sticks very, very quickly. You can use derivative feed forward to get that kind of very fine stopping and starting. So it's useful in some places. Okay, so the other bit about optimal rate control is the tune, and that's in a whole other talk, and I'm not really going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about that. But there are things like you got to be able to detect the error very precisely. So you got to have fast, accurate, stable sensors. You got to have good filtering. It's got to be low lag filtering. You got to get rid of noise. You got to have a good frame. You got to have motors that work well. Lots and lots and lots of stuff. You get any one of these wrong, and the rate tune can be messed up to some degree. And obviously, you're trying to push the thing. So a very stable tune is not necessarily the most responsive tune. So you're sort of playing around with how close you can get to that sort of runaway oscillation that gives you good response without sort of crashing in the corners, as it were. So whole other talk, as I said. So relevant to the implementation I've done is just thinking about the request, the rate request. So the rates are these are rotational rates. So you're making a request for a rotational rate of the copter. And there's kind of two parts from that. There's the target, which is coming from your control inputs, and which you can apply feed forward to, can be noise free, and it can also be run more slowly. Okay, so this is the point about the control inputs being slower. Your fingers just can't move that quickly. You can run the control input component of the rate request more slowly and still get the response you're looking for. Whereas the target error correction, you have to run really, really fast because you just have no control over that. You're reacting to disturbances. Has lots of noise in which you're also reacting to. And so the faster you can run there, the more you can minimize that latency, the better control that you can get. So a little bit about why Betaflight is so good, but I would say RGPilot is pretty comparable now if you do things right. And a lot of this is to do with rate control and how we've sort of optimized rate control. So obviously I've sort of missed out Leonard's whole kind of life's work of the control systems, which I take as a given here. But on top of that, obviously we had notch filtering in 4.0, which was a big improvement in terms of how we were managing noise for these sort of very fast responses. Then we pushed up the filtering rate for sensors in 4.1, which allows us to sort of address sort of aliasing issues. Again, it's sort of a noise reduction mechanism. And then also in 4.1, we had BD shot, which allows you to provide very precise control to the motors and get feedback very precisely. So you can sort of target the noise very precisely. Betaflight does all of this. And then in 4.5, derivative feed forward was introduced. And people have started to begin to use that, and it just allows you to get this sort of very sort of snappy response that people are looking for, and also PID notch filtering that Bill mentioned yesterday. So Betaflight does all of these. The thing that Betaflight does that we don't do is running the rate control loops much faster than we currently do, and this is kind of the thesis of my talk. It's a good thing. There's a PR. Hopefully, we'll get into the code base at some point in the near future. And I think with that, we're pretty close. I mean, it's difficult, you know, maybe there's some sort of little edges and stuff, but this high frequency rate control is the sort of last major piece that was separating what Betaflight could do in essentially in sort of accurate flying conditions versus what we could do. So this should now say, why is RGPilot so good, I guess. Okay, so what are the limits to rate control? So I've talked about a little bit about latency. And one of the things to remember is latency is sort of a cumulative effect. So it's not just like latency of calculating the rate outputs you want. This whole other pile of things that couple together. So you can see on the left-hand side, so we're going to read the sensor, and this is happening in an SPI thread. We're then going to apply the filters, the notch filter, and then pass on that data to a calculation for the rate outputs that we response, which involves a handoff currently to the main loop, which is also a thread. We then push the calculated outputs to the motors, where there is another thread handoff to the D-shot thread, which then makes the actual output to the motor, which then goes to the ESC. So the ESC then has to calculate what it's going to do, spin up the motor, the props turn, and eventually that control output that you're looking for based on your read of the error happens. And it's just this long chain of pieces. And what we want to do is try and squash that down as much as possible. And so what I've kind of put sort of red and green here. So SPI thread, D-shot thread, ESCs, those are all happening pretty quickly at the moment. The piece that's happening more slowly is this rate control calculation, because it's happening in the main thread. And people push the scheduled loop rate up to sort of address this issue, but it's very much constrained currently by things like GCS updates and all that sort of stuff. So, people have gone up to maybe 1 kilohertz tops, but after that, you start running into all sorts of problems. Okay, so we basically want to run the rate loops fast to reduce latency. So how do we do that? So as I've sort of demonstrated, what we want to do is minimize the latency from gyro read to the motor output. Now, one of the things we've done in this sort of in this new PR is rely on the sensor stability. So rather than measuring when we get, when we actually read samples, what we're relying on is the gyro to produce samples very regularly and rely on the timing of those samples to drive the rest of the process. So we're kind of making that assumption that the gyros are reading at a very regular basis and that we can use that timing to drive everything else. And if we make that assumption, we can then have a little queue of gyro samples that we keep in a ring buffer, and we just basically process those serially. So it almost doesn't matter when we process them, but in the ideal scenario, we're basically reading a sample when it's available, which should be roughly at the rate that the gyro is producing them. So, depends on how you sort of configure things, but say 4 kilohertz. Now, those samples, we have to process all of them for all the things we currently do, things like filtering and so on. But for the rate thread and rate control, we actually only care about the last one, right? Everything that's historical before the one we've currently got is pretty much irrelevant. It's just the last one that we can that we care about. And we can use that property to control the speed of the rate thread. So we can actually skip samples sort of evenly to make the rate thread go faster or slower, depending on sort of our CPU constraints. And that works pretty well. And so this is all happening so skipping samples is happening in the SPI thread as we read the samples. And then we have a separate new thread, rate thread, that is dequeuing those samples, applying the rate calculation, and then outputting to the motor. And ideally, what we want to do is do that for every sample. So we basically want this step. Question from Leonard.
Just a clarification, when you're talking about skipping samples, you're talking about skipping samples after those samples have been passed through the filters.
Correct. Yeah, so the EKF still sees everything. Yeah.
No, so the low pass filter, the band,
yes,
the not so processed on every sample.
Yeah.
But it's post all that filtering is where we're skipping the sample.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so and what we essentially want to do is run this in lockstep if we can. So read a sample, filter, calculate the rates, output to the motors, boom, 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 for each sample, if possible. So there's some challenges with that. So this is going quite fast now, and there's a lot going on in RGPilot. Lots of other processes, threads competing for CPU, and this is a 10x, speed improvement, for instance, from what we're currently doing. So default scheduled main loop rate is 400 hertz. So what I'm trying to do here is run the rate outputs at 4 kilohertz. So we've got 10 times the processing going on. And that means everything in that hot path suddenly becomes quite expensive. At the most, we've got 250 microseconds for each of those ticks to do stuff. And there's no way we can consume all of that 250 microseconds to process rate requests, because there's so much other stuff going on. We've got to leave plenty of spare cycles for the rest of the vehicle to behave appropriately. The other thing you've got to remember is that essentially we're processing 10 gyro samples for every main loop update. And the main loop also has a view of gyro samples. So the start of the main loop, it gets a published view of what's going on in the gyros. And it retains that published view through all of the processing that subsequently happens. Meanwhile, the rate thread is doing 10 updates. And there's a danger, and I sort of saw this in testing, that you essentially get time travel, where the rate thread and the main thread are dealing with different samples that can be in different points in time. And we want to avoid that, right? We want to have consistency between the main thread's view of the world and the rate thread's view of the world. And then a final challenge is logging. So we want to make sure that the logging is consistent as well, which means for rate related things, we want that to be output from the rate thread, not from the main thread. Because so one of the challenges here is that essentially the rate thread, because these things are happening concurrently, the main thread and the rate thread are happening concurrently, they just have a view of each other that is just changing all the time. And so we don't want to sort of lock those two together because that slows things down, but we just want to make sure that the views each has of the other is consistent at any point in time for the purposes that we want to use it for. All right, so if you use my PR, how do you set it up? So there's actually only two parameters, very easy to set up. Question from Tim. There's a mic there if you want to.
It's actually relevant to the previous slide, I think. It's always fascinated me that the 8743 has two cores. Could this rate thread run on the second core?
In theory, but yeah, there's some complexity involved there yeah. And really the complexity involved is the thing I've just described about the interaction between the main thread and the rate thread. So there's a lot of interaction going on there. If you separate that into two cores, it could still work, but you're just going to have to be super, super careful about those interactions happening in a consistent way. Yeah, that's true. It's true. Yeah. All right. So if you use my PR, how do you set it up? So there's only two parameters. So there's fast rate enable, which you basically set to 1. And if that's how you want to experiment with it, that's all you need to do. So that enables the rate thread, and it enables the rate thread with dynamic throttling. So I think one of the things you've got to realize about this is CPU is the constraint here. So even on an H7, CPU is the constraint here. And so I'm sort of trying to play with things to make sure that everything has enough CPU that the vehicle keeps flying. And so this fast rate enabled set to 1. It's basically throttling on this little queue of samples I talked about. So if you can imagine, Jira is producing samples, pushing them into a queue that gets dequeued by the rate thread. If that queue starts to grow, it basically means that the rate thread is not keeping up with the samples that are being produced. And so I use that information to throttle back the rate thread. It's sort of an indication that the vehicle is overloaded. And then I do a similar thing with the main loop. So the main loop has this ability to slow down and speed up based on vehicle load, and we can sort of read what's going on there. And if that's going on, then I can slow down the rate thread basically by skipping samples. So for instance, if I'm going reading samples at 4 kilohertz, and this is basically with a divider of 1. So for every sample producing an output, the next thing to do is have a divider of 2. So basically for every other sample produce an output and so on. And this is where this fast rate div parameter comes in. I've sort of not been able to find a sort of easier way of describing this. It works pretty well. People can get their heads around it. It sort of would make sense to describe this in hertz, but actually I found that to be more trouble than it's worth. But if you've got a better idea of how to configure this, that would be great. So
this is just a decimation ratio.
Yes, correct.
Is the engineering term. So
yes, agreed. There's an engineering term for it, so it must be simple. All right, so fast rate div you can set, and this will constrain the absolute speed that the rate thread will go at. So if you set this to 2, you will never get your rate thread running more than half of the gyro read rate, for instance. But this dynamic throttling can then happen from that fixed rate down. So you can always go slower than the speed implied by the fast rate div setting. And so this example I've just given, if you set it to 2, it divides the the rate that the rate thread is running at by 2 relative to the gyro rate. There's 2 other settings. So there's 2, which basically means I'm confident, you know, I feel lucky, which means that the rate thread output is fixed when you're armed. Then there's 3, which I tend to use for testing, which basically fixes it at all times. So you can kind of see the absolute CPU load that's going on. Because one of the things you find is there's certain operations that are quite expensive in Copter. For instance, the mag updates and the EKF is very, very expensive, and it's easy for that to kind of cause the rate thread to slow down and then speed up, slow down and then speed up, and that gets a little bit annoying if you're flying. And so, if you're sort of confident that overall the vehicle is in good shape, then you can use this setting too. So that's the sort of user configurable piece. There's some implied configuration by these things. So there's this setting servo D-shot rate that people will have maybe come across. And this is a way of outputting in D-shot at multiples of the main loop rate. So by default, D-shot runs at a fixed 1 kilohertz. But if you set, for instance, servo D-shot rate to 2, you get D-shot output at twice the main loop rate. So 400 hertz main loop rate, 800 hertz D-shot, and so on. So you can sort of scale up how fast D-shot is happening. And the main reason to do that is because you want the feedback coming back from BD shot. So you want to get that fast frequency update. But the problem with that is you don't want to sort of you don't want to have D-shot rate set to, I don't know, 4, say, which would imply 1.6 kilohertz in normal circumstances. But 4 times 4 kilohertz gives 16 kilohertz. There's no way I want to run my motors at 16 kilohertz. So servo D-shot rate is implicitly adjusted to be essentially lower or equal to 4 kilohertz to make sure that doesn't get messed up. Similarly, with the harmonic notch, there's a setting to do with running the harmonic notch at the main loop rate. So there's in INSH notch opts, you can set a setting, and basically it will do the harmonic notch updates at the main loop rate. What we want is for that filtering to occur at the rate loop rate, but not necessarily running at full rate loop rate is not worth it too fast. So at the moment, that's fixed to be half the rate loop rate. And then finally, logging is a great way of overwhelming this stuff. So trying to log at 4 kilohertz doesn't work. As you might imagine, the poor little SD card gets a bit upset. So the fast attitude logging is constrained to be at most 1 kilohertz, but never lower than the actual main loop rate. So that's the sort of implied setup. Okay, so troubleshooting. So what are the problems I ran into? So the main problem is CPU overload. This is where dynamic throttling is your friend. So you can start with dynamic throttling. There are GCS messages to tell you how fast you're going, whether it's speeding up, slowing down, and that gives you a feel for whether this is all just in Copter, by the way. There's only a Copter feature, not playing at the moment. And if you're not doing very well, if you need to get more CPU so you can run the rate loop faster, how do you do that? Well, there's a number of things you can do. One is to use fewer IMUs. So that reduces the CPU load from the sort of SPI threads. You can reduce the main loop rate. So this is one of the nice things about this change is once you start running the rate loop independently and fast, the need to run the main loop fast kind of goes away. So you can certainly don't need to run it more than 400 hertz, but you can actually probably lower it even more than that because it's only this rate loop reacting to error is the thing that needs to happen quickly. You obviously can increase fast rate div to slow down the loop rate. You can remove fast rate logging. And also you can reduce the overall gyro rate. That's another way of getting more CPU. So these are all ways of getting CPU if you're overloaded. Okay, so I have flown this. Well, you saw it flying yesterday, so it does work. what was the testing that I did? So basically I did testing with different fast rates. And there were 3 tests I ran. First was running sysid and running Bill's new spiffy tool that he'll describe later in the day. And I've got some graphs about that, so we'll look at those in a minute. But sysid basically oscillates the vehicle from very slow to quite fast. With these changes, you can actually get quite a fast oscillation. In fact, so fast you have to be a little bit careful that the copter doesn't climb away. But it's a good way of sort of seeing the physical response of the vehicle. I then also used this enable stats feature that is a way of looking at CPU load for individual threads. And then finally running auto tune for all of these different settings, because one of the things that you see with these changes is that basically you can get higher PIDs, so you can basically get higher responses for the vehicles. All right, so probably a little bit hard to see here, but this is Bill's tool. He will explain all later. But for my purposes, this is running on a sysid at, like there's something being hidden on the right hand side here. I don't know whether we can. Yeah, all right. Move over here. Okay. So this first one is for, so what we're interested in is this 180-degree crossing point in the calculated rate. And you can see here that for 400 hertz, that's 20 hertz. And I'm sure Leonard can give a very technical overview of why we're looking at this. But basically, we want this to move to the right. So for 400 hertz, we've got 20 hertz here. And whoop, and then at 1 kilohertz, you can see we've got 22 hertz. And then at 2 kilohertz, still a bit more than 22 hertz. And then 4 kilohertz, we've got 23 hertz. And so it's sort of a way of demonstrating that there is an actual improvement in the response of the vehicle using system ID. Now, these numbers may not seem like a lot, but they actually make quite a big difference to the overall tune, for instance. So, it's got really too small. So similarly, CPU load. So let me move this back over. So at 400 hertz, you can just about see that so I'm cheating a little bit here, but you can see this SPI1 thread is running at 4 kilohertz, and that's got 20% of the CPU. You can see there's 40% idle, and then the rate thread is taking 3.8% of the CPU. And if we go up to 800 hertz, you can see the SPI thread's roughly the same, 20%. Rate thread's now up to 7.4%, and idle is 32%. Go to 1 kilohertz, SPI thread still similar. The rate thread is now at 9%, idle 27%. 2 kilohertz. Okay, now we're getting into it. So SPI thread still the same. Rate thread is now consuming 20% of this, or 18% of the CPU, 16% idle. And then at 4 kilohertz, you can see there's only 7% idle. SPI thread is the same, and the rate thread is consuming 28% of the CPU. So you can see 8 kilohertz is probably beyond this copter at these rates. So this is the thing about running fast, is you can consume quite a lot of CPU quite quickly if you're not careful. But it does work, running at 4 kilohertz, there's still idle cycles left, which is great. And then in terms of the tune, so this is my tune at 400 hertz, and you can see that we've got quite high angle P's here, but the things to look at are the P values. So we've got 0.047 on roll, 0.085 on pitch. And then if we move to 2 kilohertz, we've got 0.072 on roll, 0.080 on pitch. and angle p-values are still the same. And then 4 kilohertz, we've got 0.089 or 0.09 on roll and 0.131 on pitch. So if we compare that to the 400 hertz value, see it's getting on for about double. So the PIDs are roughly doubled, maybe a little bit less at 4 kilohertz versus 400 hertz. I should point out this is not the tune on this copter. This is on a different copter, which is much harder to tune. I probably should have done it on this copter. But even so, you sort of get, even on a copter that's got a lot of frame resonance and all the rest of it, you still get very good results from this. So, oh gosh, that's hard to see. Black on purple, there we go. All right, so the advantages of this, dramatically reduce latency from sensor read to motor output, which is the main sort of thrust that I've been talking about. There's some other advantages to do with PID filtering. So we do filtering in the PIDs. So if you think about Filt D and Filt E and Filt T, those are all running at much faster rates now. So 4 kilohertz, for instance, in this example. And so you get a higher Nyquist frequency, improved anti-aliasing. So there's some good sort of filtering benefits there. But the thing to note is really the improvements are most noticeable on small agile copters with responsive motors and ESC. So if you've got a big copter that moves only slowly, you're not going to see much benefit from this because it just can't physically react quickly enough to what it's being told to do. Whereas on a small copter like this, with very responsive motors and ESCs, it can react very, very quickly, and you do get this big, really quite big benefit. So future work. So we're having some discussions about how we can lower the FIFO read rates for the non-primary gyros, because one of the things you've got to remember about rate control is you really only care about the primary gyro. The EKF cares about the others if you're going to have a lane switch. But as far as rate control is concerned, only the primary gyro and only the latest value that's come out of the sensor that is relevant. If we do that, we can sort of reduce some of the CPU load from the unused sensors. We're sort of discussing making this the default in Copter at some point to remove some of the complexity. So at the moment you can sort of turn it on, turn it off, the thread starts, stops, all the rest of it. But if we made it the default, then some of the complexity in the code would go away. Not quite related to this, but the target updates could be done in sort of a more noise-free way, which I'm sure, again, Leonard can talk about if you're really interested. And then there's also the question is, we're only running the rate controllers fast. Should there be anything else that we run faster as well? Would that have any benefit? Difficult to know, but maybe. And that is it. These are my details. If sorry, Fossio V does consultancy on the side. I do, software development and all the rest of it. Please get in contact. And I've got a little YouTube channel which you can't see here, but I'm also hoping to do a few little sort of vignettes while in the conference. So if you're happy to be videoed, I'll come around with my camera. But thank you. Any questions? Question.
On the CPU load charts that you had up, how many IMUs were you sampling?
3. All 3. Yeah, but I was cheating because I was doing this lower FIFO read rates on the non-used ones. So
have you run across Inspector Morse?
Yes.
Seriously?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, very cool.
Thinking about your sort of D and I terms in particular, have you thought about conversion between, because you're talking about trying to baking this in as a default.
Mm-hmm.
Any speculation as to, is it safe to just bump up the rates and D and I go, and you can say that your sort of temporal based parts of your controller are safe to run at a faster rate, but you could get more if you boost them? Is there any change, basically, is what I'm asking?
So I think if we made this the default would be the rates that you currently have just running in the new architecture, so 400 hertz. So, and I think on F4s, for instance, that's, I think you could probably, given what people try and do with F4s, I'm sure it's safe to go a bit faster than that, say 1 kilohertz for the rates, but whether any more than that, I don't know. But that's sort of the open question of what happens to all of those other controls. At the moment, you can only compile this for F7 and H7. It basically compiled out. If you try and compile it, it won't compile for F4. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's sort of you don't have to run. There are some sort of latency benefits here anyway in the way the architecture works without running everything really fast. Pete?
So obviously, some flight controllers have multiple IMUs, and those IMUs might be running at quite different rates. So if you have a primary IMU switch, there could be quite a big change because you're just decimating the IMU samples that would change the rate at which your rate controller is running at. So how do we deal with that?
Well, so this happens already, right? So we get dynamics. If you do fast rate 1, you get dynamic switching of the rate in flight, and it's fine. So one answer might be, don't deal with that. Just sort of let it happen. If we decide that it is a problem, then we'll have to figure out how to sort of scale appropriately between them. But I've certainly in my testing, I've not, I've had it sort of going all over the place.
Mentioned that the rates, the backend rate changes, but it only happens, like we already discussed, it only happens like when you're trying to get the
Samples, right? Like we want to get one sample which matches the backend rate hertz, but it only changes once.
Right, but I think isn't Pete's thing different because we're relying on the timing of the samples for this to work.
Right.
But I think you're saying if the timing of the
I
samples.
think Pete is saying that
differently.
if it changes between the IMUs, right? Like if one IMU is running at 2 kilohertz and the second IMU is running at 3 kilohertz, right? So you suddenly jump to the second IMU and you're completely changing the rates and stuff.
Yeah.
But if you were actually combining them and making them in a sort of instead of 3 kilohertz, you're running at say 400 hertz, right? So you're already decimating it. So it's not that big of a deal. But if it is changing from 2 kilohertz to 3 kilohertz, you're completely changing the control, the gains that are required to tune the copter.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I have noticed is, so if you stick with your original gains, then everything is safe. If you run at 4 kilohertz and then auto tune and dial everything up, if you then try and run more slowly, you can get a little bit more, the gains are then too hot for essentially the updates. So that's one thing you'd have to be certainly be careful about.
Also, you talked about actually dynamically changing the gyro rates. Are you also changing the rate of the rate control loop as well with that?
Yeah, so the rate thread is scaling up and down.
Right.
That's the thing that's changing.
So what's the impact of that on the whole, again, the gains and stuff that you have set? It's going to change, and it's also the time, the response of the frame itself is going to change based on how fast you are.
Yeah, so certainly,
and your filters, notch filters, everything is going to sort of vary, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the main thing is the impact of the gains, I think.
Right.
So I think the notch filters and so on will work fine.
Right.
But it's more of whether you've tuned it to the faster rates and then try and go slower. I think that's where the problem is. If you tuned it to the slower rates and then try and go faster, it's all fine.
I mean, it's still like and when we are slowing down, so you're slowing down by you're dividing by a factor, right? Like a 2 or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a thing that you need to see that when we are running at 1,000 kilohertz, when we say 1,000, it's usually not 1,000, it's more like 990 or 5 or something.
Yeah,
And when you divide it by 2, it's not going to be an exact harmonic as well. So it's
right.
and if you're really, really unlucky, it may sit right on the, on the resonance frequency of the frame and can cause other issues as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally, so the filters are always running at the
Right.
higher rate, right? So
Yeah.
it's only the rate loop that's scaling up and down. So there's no change to
The filters.
the Nyquist for the filters
Filters.
or anything like that. It's simply, but there is a change, obviously.
But you are changing the control frequencies though,
yes,
right? So, I mean, that can.
yeah, but I mean, a lot of this is about higher is better, right? Running at so
I think that's also another thing, like, is higher better or improving the latency better, right? So rather than running incredibly fast, what you want to do is reduce the time
Well,
between the responses.
there's two, right? So there's the latency bit, but then
Yes.
there's also the fact that the
rate.
filtering is happening at a higher rate, and so
Yeah.
you're getting benefits there from
Yes, of
the
course.
bit filtering.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I think the summary is, it sounds to me that the summary is you just need to be careful when you're tuning and sort of tune for the worst case.
Yes, correct.
Um,
Yes, which is
basically
kind of true.
Test everything carefully,
Yeah.
right?
Tune for the worst case, but that's kind of that's good advice anyway, right?
I'll make a couple of points on this. The higher rate, the faster you're running the rate, your average latency is half your sample period, like half of the rate you're running. So that's if you're operating now and you're operating here, for half that time, you're actually operating on old data. Hang on, let me talk. So as you run faster, just the inherent fact that you're running at a high frequency does give you the ability to tune sharper, and because the effective latency is reducing. The fundamental latency at the beginning of that sample is always there, and the shorter we can reduce it, that just subtracts off everything, but it becomes a higher portion of your overall latency as you go to faster and faster update rates on your PID loops. So there is that. You do expect simply by increasing your update rate to see improved PID loop gains. And what everybody has said here about, you should really be tuning your aircraft up to the lowest expected update rate that you're going to see. And so, it would be fair to, if you can run at a decimation ratio of 2, to tune your aircraft at a decimation ratio of 4, and then turn it up to 2. And all that does is just give you a little bit more stability with that existing tune. So I think, there is that fundamental improvement expected from a higher update rate. Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, Randy here. So I think you mentioned earlier on in the talk that about the EKF's yaw update and how much time that takes, and it's variable. We don't update it every
The mag fusion, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, the mag fusion for the yaw estimate. Is that totally resolved with this, or do we need to look through the code and find these bits of functionality that consume a whole bunch of CPU and try and throw them off into a separate thread so that they cause less problems, or is it resolved with
No,
this?
so it's not a threading issue. It's a pure CPU cost. So the mag fusion is basically just very, very expensive, and once it starts running, it sort of has to complete. And if you're trying to do lots of other stuff at the same time, it just takes a bit longer. That's the problem. So I think obviously it'd be nice to make that piece of code more efficient. But I don't know how we do that. Have to get Paul involved or something. So the approach I've taken is just to make this stuff as efficient as possible, so it doesn't impact kind of the rest of what's going on. Any other questions?
So taking a step back and looking kind of more qualitatively at the flight feel of this, if you take a diehard beta flight pilot, hotshot pilot, and kind of give them before this PR, and have them fly against Ardu pilot, like what kind of feedback do you get in terms of what they like and don't like? And then with this PR, like, do they say it feels identical or do they still?
So I have
Or-
a limited sample set.
Okay, if you're the hotshot pilot, then what's your feedback?
No. So I have a limited sample set that's not just me. So the reasonable beast flight pilots I've tested this on really like it. So say that it feels qualitatively different. In a sort of weird way, because you end up not getting this very jerky sort of response. It's a much smoother response. And yeah, certainly they are certainly able to notice the difference significantly. But of course, that all gets also into the feel of it, and there's a lot to do with how the input is shaped and all that sort of stuff that affects that response as well. But yeah, generally, I mean, I can certainly tell the difference when I'm flying, and I'm not a great pilot, but yeah, those who are certainly a lot better than me say it is great. And I think one of the things where you really notice it is in the corners where the copter's trying to do a lot. There's a lot of prop wash going on. There's a lot of disturbance. It's those sorts of situations where this works much better. Just sort of going flat out in a straight line, probably not going to notice an awful lot of difference. Tridge.
Really great work, Andy.
Sorry, I should say Tridge started this work. Shout out to Tridge. Yeah.
I did. My implementation was pathetic compared to what you've done. So I think the one missing piece that might still be an opportunity to gain a little bit more latency is triggering the DMA for the D-shot output, because that's still happening in a separate thread, as I understand it, in the current PR. And I think we're going to have to find a mechanism for the rate thread to prompt the triggering of that DMA to happen immediately that the output is available. Because I think that you've got some variable timing. The RC output thread is running at a priority 1 slot higher than your rate thread. But that's the same priority as the boost priority of the main thread, right, which means sometimes that main thread is going to be holding the CPU, and your RC output thread that needs to trigger that DMA is going to be held off for some indeterminate period of time. Yeah. And I suspect you're losing 100 or 200 microseconds there sometimes. And if we could find a way to trigger that DMA immediately, you might find you get a little bit less jitter.
Yeah, no, I agree. And an example of this where it's really bad is where we're sharing DMA channels, and
indeed,
and then you can get really very long delays. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting. Ideally what you want to do is schedule everything so it's sort of nothing's trying to happen at the same time, but obviously in a sort of multi-threaded situation, that's quite hard to achieve.
Particularly tricky when you've got other types of outputs on the same vehicle, like some servos and other things that are all being driven by the same RC output thread. Yeah. But if we can get that last little bit, I think you'll get a little bit more even output.
Yeah, agreed. Nope, good. All right, thanks everybody. One more time. Thank you, Bill. Sorry, I should move out of the way.